All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the Ideas Matter podcast. My name's Alex.
My name's Louis.
We're back at you with an episode after when was our last one? I think it was like the start of November.
Yeah, it was last year. I think, yeah, November. Yeah, November 2021. So a lot has happened since then.
Yeah, we like to keep you guys waiting. But
Yeah.
as we promised, we're back at you with an episode on Marx. We would never let the listeners down. All 12 of you guys.
Yeah, I don't know how many people forgot about the podcast in our hiatus. But yeah, we did say we were going to do like a what is Marxism episode, right? And I think part of the reason why we've taken so long, another part of it is we both had COVID at various intervals. But
had to fly overseas for a month.
yeah, Alex has been overseas. I got COVID when you were overseas, and then you got back, and then you got COVID. But I think another reason aside from that is we were just kind of like, well, how the hell do you do, a 1 hour episode on what is Marxism? Because it's just such a huge topic. And I think it's fair to say we didn't really know where to start. And I think I certainly felt like no matter where we started, we weren't going to do it justice. So rather than framing the episode as what is Marxism per se, because then of course you open yourself up to allegations of missing things or misinterpretations, etc. But rather focusing on a single text of Marx's. And we decided to do the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts, which are interesting and important for a number of reasons.
Yeah. So these manuscripts were written in 1844. He would have been around 26 years old by that time, I think. I have a little bit of a biography written up here. So in the year or two prior to, writing these manuscripts, Marx had completed a PhD in philosophy. He was associated with a philosophical movement called the Young Hegelians, which we'll get a bit into Hegel a bit later. Not too much because there's also too much to talk about in Hegel, but it was a big influence on him. And the Young Hegelians were kind of like this left-wing critique / left-wing followers of Hegel's thought. He edited a radical newspaper in Germany, which then got banned by the Prussian government, and moved over to France, where he became co-editor of another radical newspaper, a German language one. And he wrote these manuscripts whilst in Paris as part of his study into political economy, like politics, philosophy, pretty much in his process of study of like trying to figure out, okay, like what is it that I think? Like I have like a certain idea of how I view political economy in the world, but I'm going to undergo this period of study and writing and reflection and figure out exactly what that is. So this collection of manuscripts is, as far as I'm aware, the first real laid out thesis of Marx talking about what Marxism is. Like he never called it that, but this is the kind of earliest instance of it, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, and I think so you said he just finished his PhD. I think that was at the University of Berlin, right?
He like did his PhD at Berlin, but because he kind of had like a radical thesis, he didn't submit it at Berlin. He submitted it at another university because the professors at Berlin were more conservative.
Interesting. I didn't know that bit. Okay, cool. Yeah, and then so you mentioned that Marx was a member of what was called the Young Hegelians, and I think the too long didn't read story of the Young Hegelians is basically that Hegel thought that history would culminate in what he called the absolute truth, and sort of the socio-political system would basically like no longer need to be improved, right? I mean, it's really like interesting view of history that there's like a progress and there's direction to history, and that certain political systems can be manifestations of this deeper truth. And you think, wow, that's fascinating. And then Hegel goes, yeah, and then we're already there. This Prussian state, that's the end of history. And the Young Hegelians are like, no, we agree with your framework, but we don't think we're there yet. And obviously, so it's sort of taking the Hegelian framework, but not idolizing the Prussian state to the same way that Hegel did. And some people
No,
say Hegel.
I think constitutional monarchy is pretty much where we needed to end off.
Yeah, perhaps Hegel was right. We need to return to Hegel, as Zizek said. But in fairness, some people have said the reason why Hegel said that was because of censorship reasons. He couldn't like openly say that he, didn't support the Prussian state. But basically, the long and short of it is the young Hegelians took Hegel's framework of understanding history and the process of change, but thought that, the current political system and economic system was not yet the absolute truth. So you can sort of see already how this sort of starts to become communism, right? But I think the final point we should mention before we get into the substance of the text is that even though this was written in 1844, he never finished it. So it was unpublished. And it wasn't actually published until 1932. So after the establishment of the Soviet Union, which is important. And then it wasn't published in English, I think, for another decade or two after it was published in Russian. And it made waves at the time because obviously you can imagine, right, that like you have this stereotype of communism as being very like cold, brutal, not caring about the individual, not caring about individual human flourishing. But then you have these manuscripts discovered, and what you actually see is Marx was incredibly humanist, at least in his early thought. Sometimes you have a distinguishing between early Marx and late Marx. But at least early Marx, which is the Marx of the manuscripts that we're talking about today, was very much concerned with individual flourishing and was very much, what I think in his own terms, a natural humanist or a naturalist humanist in the tradition of Feuerbach. So it was interesting academically because it kind of turned Marx on its head for a lot of thinkers.
Yeah, 100%. That the whole humanism aspect of it is what really sets this text apart from the rest of his writings, because he, there's always kind of an implicit concern for like the well-being of workers and what kind of life they can lead in the rest of his works, or at least the ones I've read. I haven't read Capital or any of the bulky ones like that, so I'm not really a pro on this. But in this text, that's really where he makes that concern about like the well-being, about the kind of moral and communal and like aesthetic experience of life, of working people, where he pushes that to the forefront. And the main concept in which he explores that is his idea of alienation. That's like there's a bunch of different things in his text where he talks about political economy and private property and wages and all of that kind of stuff. But the meatiest part of this, the thing that if you're studying a course and you end up looking at Marx and you happen to get something, you happen to get a reading from this text in particular, you are going to be looking at the part where he talks about alienation. So we will be getting to that in a bit, but I feel like it's easier and a bit more informative if we work up to that in the same way that Marx does. Is there anything else you wanted to bring up before we get stuck into it?
I think that's a perfect segue. But one thought I did have when you were talking about alienation is like, yeah, I think you're absolutely right to say alienation is kind of the crux of all of Marx's later critiques of capitalism, because it sort of helps you understand why he is critiquing capitalism. Like this is actually his central concern, is that under capitalism, workers are alienated. And we'll get into what that means shortly, but I think it's just really helpful to bear that in mind, that is what Marx is concerned with, is alienation. And capitalism is bad insofar as it alienates workers and alienates people from other people and the fruits of their labor. So I just wanted to flag that. And another point is, if you ever hear someone say, oh, Marx hated capitalism, they don't know what they're talking about. Right, just do not listen to those people, because he did not hate capitalism. In fact, he would have never used a phrase like that. He was very much, perhaps not the early Marx, the Marx we're reading today, but certainly the later Marx. And here I'm drawing on Isaiah Berlin's excellent biography of Karl Marx called Karl Marx, which I recommend to everyone. he made a really interesting point that like Marx was a very sort of rational thinker and sort of looked at politics in a very, methodical, things happen by necessity in politics. So he didn't have a lot of time for these kind of like dramatic, histrionic, overtly, emotional critiques of capitalism. He just sort of thought, no, this is a process. Socio-political development is a process that's leading somewhere. So he would have never said, I hate capitalism. In fact, what he did say was that capitalism has been phenomenal at lifting a lot of people out of poverty. And I think it is the famous quote that it's saved a lot of people from the idiocy of rural life. So he actually had a lot of positive things to say about capitalism because he thought that communism would not be possible unless you first generated the wealth and the technological progress and the productive capacity for communism to be possible. I just wanted to flag that because, what's like the first criticism you hear of Marxism? Oh, well, we need capitalism. We need free markets to create wealth. Yeah, that's what Marx said. Like that's actually like it's not a critique of Marxism, but whenever anyone says that, they're just telling you how little they know about Marx. So Marx didn't hate capitalism. He just thought it had problematic elements to it, chief among them being alienation. So he was writing this manuscript to sort of understand elements of political economy. What he's talking about is like people like Smith, Ricardo, other classical economists. So today, I guess what he's talking about is just economics. So whenever we say political economy, just sub in the term economics.
Yeah, I thought that was a really good point. On the whole thing of the misinterpretation of Marx, it's not just something you see on the right. You see that on the left as well, where you're talking about these. Marx isn't an emotional critic. He's not a real knee-jerk thinker, and you see a lot of this same sort of knee-jerk reaction among left-wing people who nominally support Marx. But when you read him, you see how large the discrepancy is between the two. You think of all people like hate posting online about like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, and it's like, well, no, they very well might be like personally odious people, but if you asked Marx about this, he'd say you're missing the point here. This is broader, and these people act out of necessity. They're following their own imperatives that make sense for them to follow, and you can critique the thing that leads to those imperatives, but you're kind of missing the point if you critique the imperative itself. Does that make any sense? I feel like I just
that makes complete sense.
Yeah.
And again, this is something that really comes across, I thought, quite clearly in Isaiah Berlin's biography of Marx, because he talks about if you just for a moment, even if you disagree with it, think about it in the way Marx thought about it, right? As capitalism being a necessary stage in the development of human society, right? Because he thought that there were laws that sort of govern the development and the progression of human society, right? And so once you rationally understand that, it's irrational to want it to be any other way. It's irrational to hate the dynamics of capitalism because they're necessary, according to Marx. They're just playing out according to their own rational dynamic. And when they run themselves out, then you'll get something else. But it's irrational and a waste of time to be in a capitalist society and, spend all your time talking about how much you hate, I don't know, supply and demand or the accumulation of capital in fewer and fewer hands. I mean, those things, have negative consequences. But to Marx, they're dynamics, they're features of this system that are completely necessary to its functioning. So it's kind of a waste of time to be overtly emotional and, I guess, histrionic about it. He's a very clear-minded thinker.
Yeah, 100%. I'm not sure if it's in this text. I think it might be in another one, but he has a line somewhere. I'm just paraphrasing here, where in response to people saying like capitalism was a misstep for human development, he says, dude, like you don't want to go live in feudalism. Like you really don't want that. Like the only way through is forward. Like you don't want to be stuck like tilling some field for a lord and then you die because like a neighboring duke raided your lands and pillaged your farm. Like that's not a good life that you want to leave.
Yeah,
And
yeah, absolutely.
just one more thing that I want to mention as well before we get stuck into it. Marx really wears his influences on his sleeve here. There's, I know you've mentioned this to me a couple of times, or we were talking about this, in preparation for this pod. But this whole idea of people saying Marx is, a radical break. He's a radical breakthrough in thoughts, in Western thoughts. He stepped away from the Western tradition or whatnot. And you read him here, and there are so much of the text is quotes and big block quotes as well. Like he'll just print out massive paragraphs from the people he's reading. Like you said, the political economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo. Also, political thinkers from France. French socialists like Charles Fourier. And also philosophers, like you said, Feuerbach and Hegel. And these are all ideas that were, floating around in the mainstream, at least in intellectual circles at this time. And once you see how he kind of puts these all together and forms his own idea out of them, it doesn't look like a radical break at all. It just looks like a natural development, not necessarily like it's a matter of debate whether or not it's like a natural development towards truth or better knowledge or whatnot. But like this really is a natural outgrowth out of the ideas that were already around. There's really not much radical about it, other than maybe his political intents. But intellectually, like this is well within the prevailing ideas.
Yeah, and as you said before about misinterpreting Marx, this is something that both the nominal left and right are equally guilty of, because on the sort of reactionary right, you've got people who say, oh, we need to see all these cultural Marxists, undermining Western civilization. It's all a Marxist plot, blah, 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 blah. As if Marx is not completely within the historical trajectory of Western civilization, right? Like, as you just said, he's a deeply, imbued in the Western intellectual tradition, drawing on like Hegel, for God's sake, who himself was drawing on Kant, and he's observing the French Revolution, and like if you love capitalism, like so much of Marx in this text is, as you said, copy pasted Adam Smith. So it's kind of absurd that people on the right would claim that Marxism is somehow, I don't know, this spear directed against quote unquote Western civilization. But equally so, on the left, you've got these kind of, I don't know, reactionary people who say, oh, everything bad that ever happened to the world is because of Western civilization, et cetera, et cetera. It's, necessarily patriarchal, racist, a set of ideas, which may have some truth to that. But then they identify as Marxists, as if Marx himself is not, like, as I just said, like a deeply Western thinker. The way he views the world is coming out of this Western tradition that exists. And that is something that Marx himself would openly say, because he is what is called an historicist thinker. He thinks that ideas reflect the historical times that they're in. You can't sort of step back and talk about morality or analysis, a million feet off the ground. Like, you're embedded in a context. So Marx himself, is a deeply historicist thinker. And I think, as we're talking about him today, it's worth bearing that in mind, that so much of this is influenced by, previous thinkers and philosophers.
Yeah, for sure. And another thing, man, this whole here's another thing before we get into the meat of it, but there's so much to go through. I just want to mention this as well, that he's also a deeply kind of aesthetic thinker. Some of it's really implicit, but there are parts of this where he quotes Goethe, the famous German poet, author. He quotes Shakespeare. He quotes Don Quixote, the famous Spanish novel. And his idea of, well, we'll get into this later, but his idea of like an ideal life is one in which people can dedicate it to art and aesthetic beauty. at least in part. And as well, I have to say, his prose, some of it can be dry, but then like sometimes he'll just like come out of nowhere with this like stunning turn of phrase. Like he'll just hit you like a couple of lines that are like just punches you in the face with like how good it is. Like, wow, this dude really like earned his living as a writer, and he deserved it because, yeah, dude can write. Anyways, that's my kind of pea brain tangent there. Let's get into it now. All right, so he starts off with a section where he discusses wages and the relationship between labor and capital. And while you spend any amount of time looking into Marxism and the ideas of labor and capital, two of the central ideas, two of the central concepts that underpin the whole philosophy. So what do these mean? What is labor? Well, per Marx, we all have an idea of kind of what labor is. You know, labor is when you go work. Labor is when you go, you know, do something with your own body, with your own minds, to a certain ends, to kind of like create a product, to do a service, to you know, do something. So pretty much for Marx, this is fairly the same. Labor is individual human activity to, you know, harness resources or create and whatnot. And he views this as something that's kind of inherent to people. You know, part of what it is to be human is to labor. You know, another misconception of Marx is Marx didn't want people to work. He hated working. No, like that is completely wrong. Like if you read him for any amount of time, you realize that he thought working, like the kind of just the fact of laboring is part of what makes us human. You know, it's a fundamental part of who we are. So that's one of his pillars there, labor. And there's another pillar, capital. Capital is a big concept. I'm pretty sure his idea of what it was changes a bit when he gets a bit later. He has 3 volumes of a big book called Capital, where he lays this out in his later thought. But as it stands now, this is early Marx, you know, this is a couple of decades before he wrote all of that stuff. Capital is, here we go, verbatim. Capital is stored up labor. So it's pretty much the value of all the accumulated labor of a capitalist employees. So note here that, you know, capital is stored up labor. You know, it's accumulated labor. This really goes against the grain of, you know, our modern idea of capital being something you can get out of finance as well, or get out of, you know, real estate speculation, you can get out of stocks and whatnot. Because a lot of these things, there's no real labor costs associated with it so much, you know, like where is the labor value of cryptocurrency? You know, it's something that can, you know, shoot up and down based on the whims of a market, but not necessarily based on any labor that goes into the cryptocurrency or any labor that is associated with cryptocurrency. So this has been kind of a matter of critique, whether or not you want to accept Marx on what he says about the nature of capital. But as it stands now, this is just what he means by those terms. Labor is work. It's something inherent in humans. It's harnessing resources. It's creating. Capital is stored up labor. It's accumulated labor. Right. Now, another fundamental thing for Marx is the idea of the division of labor. So let's think back historically, like Marx would. If you're living in, say, a feudal society, you live rurally, you live in a household with your family, or you live in a small community, and there is something of a division of labor. You know, there were some people who do some things better than other people. There's sort of a natural division of labor. You know, maybe someone is just like peculiarly talented at, say, making axes. So it doesn't make sense for everybody in this society to make axes when there's one guy who's really good at it and everybody else can just focus on doing their own thing and then contribute that to the whole. But the amount of the severity of the division of labor in a capitalist society is a lot different from in this feudal society, because in this feudal society, this person making the axes, he would be making them from kind of start to finish. He would be making the handle of the axe, the wooden handle. He would be fashioning the tip of the axe from iron or whatever kind of metal he had on hand. He would be sharpening it. He would be putting it all together. This is very different from the kind of thing that happens in a factory. If you're a factory worker, let's say you're making axes in a factory, you work in an axe factory. It's a very different process from what that feudal guy was doing. You won't be doing the whole thing from start to finish. You won't be fashioning the wooden handle. You won't be, forming the head of the axe from metal. You won't be shaping that. You won't be sharpening it. You won't be putting it all together. You will be doing one small part of this process. Maybe your job is exclusively making handles. You're getting the wood, you're fashioning it down. And maybe even then there'd be someone else engraving into that wood because that's more efficient. And then there's a whole other section of this factory where people are focusing on the head of the axe. There are people, getting it from a hunk of steel into, the general shape. And then there are other people who are sharpening this head of the axe. And the result of all of this is something that is far more efficient, because each individual person's task is so small and so easily done that this whole process can be done at a much faster rate than just having one bloke sitting in a hut making axes out in the countryside on his own. But there is another side to this. What Marx, I think it's fair to say Marx would consider this a downside, is that it reduces the worker kind of to a machine. He has this phrase here of a worker working in a factory under this kind of conditions of division of labor. He is thus depressed spiritually and physically to the condition of a machine, and from being a man becomes an abstract activity and a stomach. You're not creating something from start to finish and having that whole thing be your product. The thing that you're doing is this menial repetitive activity that can pretty much be done by a machine. And this doesn't bode well for the individual people who are involved in this process. This is kind of like angling towards this idea of alienation, but we will get to that in a little bit. And as for the kind of relationship between labor and capital, well, we can all kind of, I feel like anyone who's listening to this can, we don't have to really spell out that it's better being a CEO than it is being a worker. You're going to have a better life. You're going to have more time on your hands. You're not going to be doing backbreaking work. You have more money. You have more leisure and whatnot. And this is something that Marx spells out as well. He kind of goes from first principles on this, but I don't think we really have to be doing that. So that's kind of encapsulates the relationship between labor and capital in broad, brief terms there. And from there, I want to move on to conflicts between capitalists. This is something that Marx kind of carefully outlines himself, and goes against a common sort of misconception of Marx, where people think, well, there's just two factors, there are two classes in his entire schema. There's capitalists and there's workers, and that's that. There's nothing else. Whereas Marx, at least here, makes it clear that even within a certain class, in this instance, in the capitalist class, there are sort of different strata. There are different levels in it. And he talks here about big capitalists and small capitalists. And what he argues here is that capital has a tendency to accumulate in fewer hands. So small capitalists will be outcompeted by large ones who have more resources to produce more cheap goods. And we can see this pretty easily if we look at sort of like the distribution of wealth ownership, of wealth inequality over the past couple of decades, with financial deregulation, industrial offshoring and whatnot. This has made it far easier for a smaller set of capitalists to control more of the wealth. So there is competition within this class of capitalists. The smaller ones are always at threat of being sort of outcompeted, of being taken over, of being sort of run destitute by the big ones, just because the big ones have so much more resources to throw around. Even just from the nature of them having more money to buy stuff, they can buy things in bulk, which are cheaper. So even just producing stuff, if you're producing the same amount of goods, it'd sort of be easier for someone who's a big capitalist to do it than a small one, just out of, purely out of how many resources they have under their disposal. So capital has a tendency to accumulate in fewer hands. This ends up kind of, he doesn't spend too much more time on this, but I don't know. I feel like this part is something really important to keep in mind if you're trying to look at things through a sort of materialist lens of looking at, contemporary society or past societies and asking, well, what classes are at play here? What's the relation between these classes? Because there's never any just kind of like one unified block. There are always subsections within each individual class. I think that's very important to keep in mind. Now, onto private property, which is something that Marx spends quite a bit of time on. Louis, could you take us off on this?
On private property. Yeah. So I think everything you've just said, like all the definitions of all the different concepts that are, being played around with here in the manuscripts, I think it's worth saying, as you said at the start, like what Marx is trying to do here is he's trying to get clearer for himself on what he thinks is going on. So he's reading all these classical political economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo. And a point that he makes from the outset is, a tendency of these political economists is to just treat categories like labor, like capital, and indeed private property as things that just sort of exist, when really what they should be doing is explaining how they came into being and how they relate to one another. And that is the flaw that he sees in political economy, remember, economics, as discipline. It's sort of pretending it's a science and just treating these things as if they have always existed from the beginning of time. So yeah, you touched on like his theory of labor, right? Which is strikingly, basically John Locke's labor theory of value verbatim, right? Another point on the side of Marx being very much in the Western intellectual tradition. He's kind of agreeing wholesale with John Locke, who is an arch liberal, right? That labor is what gives products or objects their value in the marketplace. Now, you might agree with that economically or not. You made an interesting point about like financialization today, where things that aren't really products of human labor still have value per se. So I think that's more of an anthropological point Marx is making. If there was one thing I'd really highlight from what you said, is that the centrality of labor to people for Marx that's really, really important for his anthropology. But basically, the problem then with private property, as Marx sees it, is you have one class of people, the capitalists or the bourgeoisie, who own the means of production, right? This is all familiar to anyone really who understands Marx. So the dynamic then is you have workers who who obviously need wages to survive. So how do they attain those wages? They go out and they sell their labor in the labor market, right? They go and get a job at a factory, as you were just saying. But what then happens is they create capital, as you were saying. Capital is objectified labor. It's sort of the physical embodiment of workers' labor. But then the problem is when they've finished that, they don't own what they've produced. It's privately owned by the firm, the company, the CEO, right? It's privately owned because one of the reasons being they own the means of production that the workers have used. And the workers just come along every morning and sell their labor. He writes quite a lot in the manuscripts about workers being reduced to commodities and just functions in the production process, right? They become means rather than ends. So they come in and they give up their labor. They're giving up their labor to someone else. That is the capitalist who owns the factory or owns the farm or what have you. And they create this capital, which is then not owned by them. It's privately owned, which is then sold. And basically, all that's left over for the workers is the wage that they attain from their day's labor, right? But the problem there is that given the dynamics of the capitalist system, there's an incentive, because you mentioned before the competition, right, between capitalists, the big capitalists and the small capitalists. To survive, you need to run a profit. So you need to push down your operating costs. What is the easiest way to do that? To reduce the wages of your workers. Now, obviously, you can't reduce them to nothing, because if people are dying because they're malnourished, you're not going to have any workers to rock up to your factory the next morning to produce stuff. So wages will fall to the absolute bare minimum, says Marx. That is the sort of the dynamic in capitalism. Wages will fall to the point where workers rock up, they labor, they get their wage, and their wage is pretty much just enough to have shelter, have some food, and to maybe reproduce and make the next generation of workers. And that's all they've got. That's all they do. That is sort of the drudgery of 19th century capitalism as Marx sees it. And one of the primary reasons for that is because you have private property. You have factories and the means of production being privately owned, which is the source of a lot of trouble in Marxism.
Yeah, exactly right. And another thing about this whole idea of private property is that something that Marx talks about again and again is accumulation. Capital is accumulated labor. Capitalists accumulate capital and they compete among one another to see who can accumulate the most capital. And part of this is, if you've accumulated enough capital, you've accumulated enough wealth, then if that goes on long enough, with just maybe not even enough people, but as long as there ends up being a great degree of wealth being held in a few hands, then that translates into power. These people have power not just over the workers in a direct economic sense of we hire you, we can fire you, we determine whether or not you work, we determine how much money you make, we determine what you do in your job, but also in a broader social, in a broader kind of political sense. We can run ourselves in parliament, we can sponsor other people in parliaments, we can get our views, we can get our interests kind of promulgated throughout society. And this isn't something he talks about so much in this, but I feel like it is a large and important part of the whole kind of Marxist equation, is the social, the political power of this class of people that arises out of that.
Yeah, right. I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, you've got all this money sort of laying around. What are you going to do with it? And one of the things you're going to do with it is you're going to, as you said, run for parliament, or you're going to sponsor people to run for parliament.
Or you're going to buy a newspaper.
Yeah, exactly. You're going to be a young Australian man in South Australia who starts out buying newspapers, then migrates to the United States and buys a television station. And then, 40 years later, you have climate denialism. Marx may have had a few things to say about the Murdoch empire. But anyway, you're right in saying this is hugely important to the whole Marxist equation, because the point is quite a simple one. It's that politics and society and culture basically just reflects who holds the economic power in your society. And under capitalism, it is those who own the means of production, because they have the time. They're not spending their whole day engaged in menial work and hard backbreaking physical labor. They've got nice air-conditioned offices, and they've got millions of dollars in the bank account. They've got the time and the money to go out and influence society and politics. So politics and culture just tends to reflect the interests of those who have power, which is it's called base and superstructure to put technical terminology on it. But I think that is, a very fundamental point of Marxism. And again, I just want to make a point here to frustrate the liberals. I don't think there are any liberals listening to this, but if there are, I was reading John Stuart Mill because I hate myself, and I decided to do that. And he made this really interesting point where he said that, society or public morality, rather, I think is what he was talking about. Public morality reflects the interests of the dominant class. And I was like, what, Marx, is that you? What's this doing in John Stuart Mill? But it's a point that a lot of classical political economists were making at the time. And again, I think it's just another, I'm going to keep saying this throughout the whole podcast. Marx is, not a clean break with all the other thought that's going on at the time, all the other Western thinkers. But you're right in flagging that as being a hugely important part of Marxism, this distinction between the base, the workers, and the superstructure, which reflects the interests of those who own the means of production.
And this really isn't, like you said, it's not a radical point. As a matter of fact, it'd be odd if it wasn't the case. Just look historically. The Normans invade England, and suddenly the upper class all speaks French. And French becomes the language of kind of nobility, of aristocracy.
Actually, on that,
French ideas, French arts, like why is that the case? It just kind of makes sense that the ideas, that the interests of the most powerful people somewhere ends up seeping down through the culture.
Yeah, just on that point about the Normans invading England, it is illegal to this day. I don't know if it's illegal, rather, but you're not supposed to speak another language other than English in Parliament, except for one other language, and that is French. And people might want to fact check me on this, but I believe the same is true of Australia, because we inherited the Westminster tradition. You can actually get up in the Australian Parliament and give a speech in French, but because of the historical, baggage that we carry, that is technically allowed.
Damn, we should pay someone to go do that. We should campaign. Yeah, French speaker in Parliament.
This is the real lack of representation that keeps me up at night. The lack of French speakers in the Australian Parliament.
Bring back the Normans.
Bring back the Normans. Absolutely. But yeah, look, it's just another good example of like Marxist historicism, right? If you want to understand society, you want to understand what's going on, you got to understand, how these things sit in relation to their historical trajectories.
Yeah, 100%. And it's also, I feel like it's kind of worthwhile to have a little look at what Marx thinks about feudalism and sort of like the transition from feudalism into capitalism. I'll just give like a little historical run through of this, speed run, Industrial Revolution. Pretty much during the Age of Exploration, you got your Genoans and your Portuguese and your Spaniards looking for a new route to Asia, so they can kind of circumvent the Silk Roads and the Mediterranean and get a direct line through to India, through to China, through to Southeast Asia. So you can get all of your great manufactured goods and fancy products and whatnot that make you a lot of money. So in doing so, they ended up making a lot of money, because guess what? You're cutting out the middleman if you're not going through the Silk Road anymore. And this, of course, you're in a small, relatively even in terms of like the kind of size and power of the countries in it area like Europe. And if one country around you starts getting a big advantage like that, if you're England and suddenly Portugal and Spain and the Netherlands are bringing in crazy amounts of cash because they started doing a little bit of this colonial trading, you're going to be like, shit, I need to get in on this too. But another thing happens here. It costs a lot of money to send a lot of ships over to the other side of the world, or people end up discovering the Americas as well. It costs a lot of money to send people over to the Americas, because guess what? You need money to fund the ships, to fund the sailors, and you need money to buy the products when you get there. So what do you do then? Well, some people in the Netherlands figured this out. They thought, well, how about we start raising a bit of money beforehand by offering people ownership in our little venture. They can buy as much ownership as they like. And by doing so, they're giving us money. And by getting this ownership, they get a return on investment. When we come back and we sell our products, they will get money from that. This is how stocks and finance was born. So that happens, and that ended up being a very big deal. But, like I mentioned, there's this whole competition, and there ends up being a lot of stuff being accumulated, a lot of wealth being accumulated in this area of Northwestern Europe. And at some point, they figure out, well, instead of just going all the way to India or China and getting finished goods, why don't we set up our own colonies where we can get just the raw natural resources for this stuff and manufacture it ourselves? And this is where a thing called the triangular trade comes in. So if you're a business owner or something in, I don't know, Manchester, big coastal city, you're going to pay to get a ship and a crew, and you're going to sail them down to Africa. And when you're down in Africa, you are going to get some slaves there, because you don't want to pay for labor, that you lose money. You don't want to lose money. So you help some slaves over there, and you take those slaves over to the Caribbean, or you take them over to the Americas, and you get them to grow you some raw materials. You're going to get them to, plant and pick cotton or sugar or whatnot. And then you're going to get those raw materials, send them back over to England, where you're based. And when they're back in England, you're going to manufacture them there. So you get all of the profit of selling that. And that's the reason why it's called a triangular trade, is because you look at it kind of on a map and it looks like a triangle, Europe, Africa, Americas, Europe. It's a nice triangle. Not very nice for the people involved, but I don't think that has to be said. And as a result of this, you end up getting a lot of wealth and a lot of raw materials stacked up in these kind of trade, these port cities. And then you start needing more and more people to be able to work these goods. Now, this is all happening while they're still, nominally under a feudal system. There are changes and whatnot in England, especially, with parliaments getting more and more power. But, the basic relation is between, feudal lords and the people in their domains. But this new class of people, this new class of the bourgeoisie, this new class of capitalists, people making their money off of trade, off of manufacture, is bringing them more and more power. And just, I'll put a pin in this here before I digress to something else. There are lots of raw materials and there's a lot of money sitting around in these port cities. Now, around the time that this is happening, in England at least, there's something going on called the Enclosure Movement. The Enclosure Movement is a process where people in these rural areas, rural farms and whatnot, they used to live in these areas with commons, what was called commons. So there'd be an area in your feudal lord's domain where you can go and farm your animals. Anybody can go and let their sheep graze there, or anyone can go into this certain forest and you can hunt deer. And everybody has their own kind of plot of land, which is usually fairly extensive. It wouldn't have been great to, have been the farmer's fourth daughter or son, because you're going to live a pretty destitute life. But if you're the farmers themselves, like, you're doing not too badly. And the more kids you have, the more workers you have. But I don't know the specifics on this really, but a process begins whereby these feudal landowners end up having to compete with these new merchants, these people who are profiting off this triangular trade through these overseas trade cities. And to compete with them, they have to raise up money of their own. They had ruled up to this point through aristocratic privilege, through these feudal privileges. They can't do that anymore. These people they're competing with, this new class of people, they have so much money now. Money talks. So these people need money too. So what they start doing is what's called the Enclosure Movement. They start enclosing the land. You start parceling up all these commons into small pieces that are privately owned by you. And then you start renting them out at a fee. So you're not just getting tax from the people who live in your feudal lands via, X amount of grain or X amount of produce every year. You want cash money, and you're going to piece these formerly, maybe not massive, but, pretty comfortable plots of land. You're going to put them into smaller and smaller areas, smaller and smaller farm enclosures that are all fenced off now, so that you can cram as many people in there as your renters as you can, so you can make as much money as you can. And a result of this ends up being that, well, there are a lot of people kind of sitting around who no longer can be supported off of the land anymore. So like I said, people would have a lot of kids back in feudal times to work for them as farm laborers. If your plot of land has just become, half or 1/3 of what it used to be, you don't need your fifth and sixth and seventh kids anymore, because they're just more mouths to feed. They're not actually doing anything on that land because there's so much less of it. So these people end up moving from this rural countryside, into the cities, into these trade cities, into these merchant cities, where there is a lot of raw materials and there are a lot of money sitting around. Also, side note, around this time, there happens to be sort of an agricultural revolution where the productivity of agriculture booms. So the population booms as well. So what just ends up happening is you have, as a result of all these processes, sorry if this is long-winded, but I think it's kind of important to illustrate the historical point here. As a result of this broad, mix of factors, in these trade cities, you end up getting a lot of raw material sitting around, a lot of money sitting around, and a lot of unemployed people sitting around. So if you're one of these merchants, what are you going to do? Well, you're going to start putting together factories so you can produce your own goods and sell them, and put that money back into producing more goods so you can build more factories and whatnot. So there's my little speed run of how we get from feudalism to capitalism, and how private property kind of arises as part of that. So what used to be kind of, feudal lands, you had your lords of their obligations. These feudal lords, these aristocrats, because of the rise of this capitalist class, are forced to kind of become capitalists themselves. They have to act like capitalists. They can't rely on their privileges anymore. And this is a point that Marx spends a bit of time talking about as well. So I just thought it was worthwhile ranting about that for a little bit.
Have you considered studying to become a history teacher?
I never thought about that, to be honest, but I might give it a go.
Yeah, I don't know. Seems to be something that comes naturally to you. Or maybe you should consider a degree in secondary education, specializing in. I'm not sure. It's just something to consider, Alex.
I don't know about that.
I didn't know the point about the Dutch merchants. Like, were they the first people to offer shares in their company, basically?
Yeah, it was the first joint stock company. It was the Dutch East India Company,
Oh
which ended
shit.
up becoming the model for the British East India Company, which became the model for, future businesses and corporations.
Shit. I didn't know that. That's interesting. Cool. Well, yeah. I mean, so basically, yeah, we have this history of the development of capitalism. But yeah, so then as you said, you've got all these workers, right, who used to be serfs. Basically, their lives were, not great, but they had some security and stability, working for their feudal lord. But then the enclosures happened, as you said, and they got kicked off the land. And all of a sudden, they have to go into what is now called the labor market, and they have to sell their labor in order to attain wages in order to survive. Um, if you were interested in all of that, by the way, I'd really recommend a book by Yanis Varoufakis called Talking to My Daughter About the Economy, where he explains quite well the whole process of the enclosures and how, to his mind, that's the sort of starting point of capitalism. Um, but anyway, I think that is a nice starting point to go, look, well, now you've got all these workers who need to sell themselves or sell their labor rather in order to survive. But when they do that, they're selling themselves to capitalists who privately own the factories and the stores and the farms, etc. And as I said before, they're only really attaining wages that are barely sufficient to survive. So they're not really doing much else other than that. And this is why Marx is so concerned with this idea of alienation, right? He sort of distinguishes there's alienation on a number of fronts. He has I think it's 4 different kinds of alienation that he identifies in the first manuscript. But
Yeah.
I think probably the best place to start for it to make the most sense is when he talks about alienation in the process of production. And that's basically the fact that when you go into work, I think you mentioned this before, you're not engaging in self-directed labor. You're being told by someone else what to do. Basically, your day as a worker from 9 to 5, if you're lucky, uh, is dictated. Your time is dictated by someone else. So instantly, you sort of lose any sense of agency and control over your own work. And so basically, that's how you become alienated, right? Which is a weird term, and I think it comes from German, and there might not be some things that carry across neatly in the translation, but what it means is that you stand alien, you stand as an other, you become separated in some sense from what you are doing, which is a kind of a tricky concept, I think, for some people to wrap their head around. But if you've ever worked a really shitty job, which I have, and you sort of feel like you're just kind of going through the motions, you almost like you're doing them, but your mind is elsewhere. You're not really like invested in what you're doing. You have done alienated labor. And it's Marx's contention that most people under capitalism are doing alienated labor. And Alex, you made a really important point before about, well, people think Marx hated work and he just wanted people to sit at home and do nothing. But no, Marx thought that labor was actually what gave us our humanity. We are most human when we are laboring. And that is what makes capitalism so bad, is that it takes this thing that is so fundamental to us as humans, our ability to take raw materials, to take nature, and to produce it into works of art, into technology that makes people's lives better. It takes that innate human instinct to labor and it reduces it to this completely soul-crushing experience. So capitalism, by doing that to our labor, is actually doing that to our humanity in a sense. It's alienating us from ourselves. It's alienating us from our true human nature. And by extension, alienating us from one another. So he begins with this sort of very economic analysis of private property, but it very quickly snowballs into this philosophical critique of capitalism, basically bastardizing and debasing, I think is the phrase that he uses, debasing the human essence, right? In this text, he's an essentialist thinker. He's saying that there is a human nature and there is something that it is to be human. It's not all historically a byproduct. And capitalism basically takes that and it reduces it to this horrible experience, which is really, when you get down to it, is Marx's problem with capitalism, is that it takes what is so central to us and destroys it.
I just sort of tag on to that point you had about, alienation and the thing you produce, and alienation, from your, he has this phrase like species essence or species being, like the fundamental fact of what it is to be human. And the way that this kind of relates, in how Marx puts it, is that when you're someone who's freely utilizing your own labor towards an end that you want to put it to, toward an end that you're kind of passionate about, you see part of yourself, you see yourself kind of embodied in the thing that you create. So, think of someone who's like an artisan. He's like let's think back to like this axe maker. We're talking about making axes. For Marx, the idea of labor is if there's someone making axes who loves making axes, he makes an art of it. He sees part of himself in these axes that he makes, wholly by his own vision, through his own labor. There is part of his individual being in this thing that he creates. And in creating it and seeing, in giving it to other people can recognize him, the creator, in this thing that he's created. So it's this kind of, I don't know, I've mentioned this in a class once, and I had the lecturer dismiss it as being too, I can't remember if she said spiritual or too mystical, but which I can somewhat see, but I think this is a good idea, that when you really put your heart into something, there's a part of you in that thing. And part of what makes, part of how humans kind of relate to one another, at least in Marx's ideal world, is in recognizing each other in their own creations, in the own things that they make.
Yeah, well, that's kind of odd that your was that at uni?
Yeah, it was at uni.
That's a bit odd. I mean, especially that. I mean, lecturing and professing, right, is a form of labor. It's, I don't know, an intellectual labor. I would assume that lecturer would think that there was something unique about their own individual classes, right? That they sort of brought their own personality to bear on the way that they taught their content. And that if that wasn't true, why wouldn't you just get a robot to do their job? I mean, it seems kind of a bit odd that they would say that.
Oh, look, if a robot did that lecturer's job, then I think it would be better. This isn't related, but like every single one of these classes went for 3 hours, and it was just the lecturer talking in a very dry, boring, like unengaging voice. And there was no time for discussion, anything, just, and this is blah, 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 blah. By the end of the class, half of the students will be gone. They just quit. They couldn't sit through this for 3 hours. So I don't know, maybe she should have taken it on board.
Yeah, that's a bit odd. But yeah, what you're talking about, I think, is, the second, it's how you get from alienation as a process. So you're alienated from production, the process of production, to then being alienated from the product. So what you were talking about is, people tend to see themselves in what they produce. Again, I'm just really struggling to see why your professor thought that was why they had such a hard time seeing that point. Like, if you make something, it's not going to look like something you've bought from the store or something that's been mass produced in a factory. It's going to have unique qualities to it that reflect how you've engaged in the task. But as you were saying before, when you have the division of labor in factories, and I don't know, so you're making a chair, right? But literally all you do is, I don't know, sand one chair leg. And all you do for 8 hours a day, you're just sanding chair legs. When you go and see the finished product, the part of you that is in that finished product is so small, you do not really go, oh yeah, that's a product of my labor. I feel like I produced that. You become alienated from the whole experience.
You can't recognize yourself in it.
Yeah, exactly. It is alien to you. It is another, right? So you become alienated from the product. And then Marx has this interesting point I don't know if he touches on it that much in the manuscripts, or he sort of does indirectly, but because people don't see themselves in what they produce, they have this desire to go and consume. So to sort of reclaim their creative energy, or whatever you want to call it. I don't like the term energy. That does sound too mystical, but I'm not sure how else to phrase it. You sort of end your workday and you feel so, I don't know, spiritually debased. What do you go out and do with your wages? You go out and you buy stuff, you go and consume. And to Marx, this is commodity fetishism. Like the actual commodity that has been produced has more human essence in it than you do. He says this. He said what capitalism does is that it inverts the world of things and the world of subjects. Right? There's this inversion, and objects are treated like they're more valuable than actual human lives, actual human labor, and we have this sort of bizarre commodity fetishism where we go out and we just try and purchase as much stuff as we can. And one of the reasons we do that is because we find our day and our work just so immensely unfulfilling that we go out and we just consume things. And he has this beautiful section on this where he's talking about drinking and eating and having sex. And he says, well, these are animal functions, right? Because we have them in common with other animals. But they can be done in a way that is, part of human nature, socializing with your friends and getting drunk doesn't have to be a bad thing. It can be a great way to socially communicate with other people. But what happens when you're alienated is that they sort of the human parts of these things gets destroyed and they become animal instincts. It's just sort of, think about it like this, right? It's a very common critique of capitalism here today, is that people treat getting drunk, for example, on the weekend as an escape. You work Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, or maybe you start earlier, you finish later. And the week just sucks. And all you have to look forward to is getting absolutely blind drunk on a Friday and Saturday night. Marx would say, yeah, well, that's because you hate your work and you hate your life so much. At the very first chance you get, you're going to go out and you're going to drink to the point where you forget your alienated existence. And Marx has nothing against drinking and socializing, but he says that what the effect of capitalism is that it turns these things into mere animal instincts. It robs them of what makes them good, and that is socializing with one another. And it just turns them into this form of escapism.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to touch on there. I think anybody, like you brought up earlier, anybody who's worked a bad job can relate to this. I remember working the worst job that I ever really worked, and I'd be sitting there and it'd get to, end of the Monday, end of Tuesday, and it gets to the end of the week, and I'd just be dying for a drink. I don't even like drinking that much. I don't drink often at all. But when I was working this job, I was just so dead from it. At a fundamental level, just spiritually removed. I'm completely alienated from the stuff I was doing, that I thought I got to drown this out. And I'm sure that many people who are listening to this, all the many 12 of you, can relate to this.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, why do you think bars call them happy hours, right?
Yeah.
When you finish work. You finish work and you go to happy hour and you consume alcohol to try and make yourself feel happy, which is really just code for forgetting the last miserable 8 hours of your existence that day. And again, consuming, just being a consumer, right? Like, but this is all interesting because it's such a humanist point. It has such concern for the daily well-being of individuals and for people and for how people spend their time. And that is why Marx does not, I don't want to use it to say doesn't like capitalism, but that is why he's critiquing capitalism. It's because labor is central to what it is to be human, and it gets debased in capitalism. So I don't know if you ever listen to some fuckwit like Jordan Peterson, who says that like Marxists are lazy and like what they don't understand is that like you need to labor to produce or whatever, and we need capitalism to produce wealth and blah, 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 blah. Like they just do not know what they're talking about. And you mentioned species being, which I found to be a fascinating concept, right? And it's kind of a bizarre term. It's sort of a hyphenated phrase. But
You can
basically,
tell the German
yeah,
philosophical influence by the creation of these really weird kind of compound words that seem
yeah,
sort of alien when you look at them.
that don't really translate well into English.
Hmm.
I think being is a good example of that. Um,
Yeah.
but really, his point is that like I'm going to give an example of an otter. I don't know why. I think he gives the example of an otter, but like, or any animal, right, does not have consciousness of itself as a member of a species. It's just like, oh, I'm an animal, if that, right? But humans are unique in that we have consciousness of ourselves as being a member of a broader community. And so the otter, for example, builds the dam. It builds it to survive. It doesn't build a dam for the general improvement of the welfare of otter kind, right? That's not something that animals do. That's only something that humans do. We engage in technological progress for the betterment of humanity, this sort of
Why do you mean
abstract.
beaver builds a dam?
Yeah, wait, what's an otter? Aren't they
Otter
the same
is,
thing?
I don't know, it's like a little thing that like swims around. Yeah,
What?
it's really cute. Yeah, it's a different thing.
I thought they were the same thing. Oh shit.
I mean, otters are cool too,
Oh fuck, they're so cute. Now I'm
but
looking at
I'm pretty
photos of
sure they don't.
otters.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure they don't build dams though.
Ah, damn. Beavers build dams.
Yeah.
Oh, they look so similar. Oh, actually, they don't really. They look kind of different. Shit.
This is a beaver and otter podcast now.
Yeah. Damn. All right. Well, the beavers, or the betterment of beaver kind, right? It's not a thing.
Yeah.
But I think it's an interesting point that Marx is making, where he's like, yeah, you see this. This is why he's so obsessed with technology and the productive forces, is because it's to him um, that is what most clearly illustrates our humanity. We don't necessarily make technological improvements for ourselves as individuals. We do it for the human race, right? Like landing on the moon. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. It's knowledge, it's consciousness of ourselves as belonging to a social group, and that's unique to humans. Um, and so the problem with again with capitalism is that it takes our ability to labor and produce, which is how we manifest our knowledge of belonging to a species, and it perverts it by directing it towards the service of private profit rather than our interests as a species.
Yeah, 100%. And another part of this alienation thing, which I I think overlaps quite a lot with the whole species being aspect, is that and so we looked at alienation in three different ways. We looked at alienation from the product, so the thing that the worker actually makes, alienation from like the act of production, like actually being in your job and like you're doing something menial all the time. Um, alienation from your species being, and there's also alienation from other people, other workers. You know, in this system, you're not at all encouraged to view other people as having interests in common with you, or as being in some way an extension of you. You are meant to see other people, especially if you're a worker, as competitors. There is some people who can potentially take your job, if they're doing better than you, or if they're, I don't know, a fitter worker or something like that. If they have less mouths to feed, then they have a step up on you, and you start to, at least per Marx, if you're this 19th century industrial worker, um, you look at these other workers as people to be competed with, not people that you share some like fundamental nature in common with.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about all of that is that it's again a good illustration of Marx's historicism, which is just that you have to look at features of society and features of human behavior as not being fixed and eternal, but reflecting the historical context. And why do I say that? Because what is one of the most common defenses you hear trotted out in defense of capitalism? And this links to what Alex just said about competition. Humans are naturally competitive. That's why capitalism works. Well, maybe, I'm not an anthropologist, but what would Marx say is no. Humans are forced to be competitive because of capitalism. It's a chicken or the egg scenario. And personally, I think I find Marx's point here pretty persuasive, is that we're not naturally, ego driven and competitive and trying to outdo one another. We do have consciousness of ourselves as belonging to something bigger than ourselves. But capitalism, again, perverts that, right? And makes us into this mold of what it needs humans to be in order to function. It turns us into its ideal subjects. It makes us competitive and self-interested and rational in a very sort of calculative, egocentric way. But Marx's whole point is that this is not what we truly are, which is interesting because in saying that, he is sort of arguing that there is a human essence. There is something that it is to be human. And again, I'm going to beat this drum one more time. Where does this come from? It comes from Aristotle, right? That man is a social animal and that man has an essence, right? And that gets picked up by Hegel and carried forward by Marx. So again, it's very much in this, long-standing Western philosophical tradition.
Yeah, and it slots in very well to the whole communitarian streak that we've been on recently. If you've listened to the prior episodes of the pod, we've covered communitarian philosophers like Charles Taylor, who look around at the kind of modern world and the way people conceive of society, the way people conceive of themselves as these like isolated competitive individuals, and they think, no, there's a lot more of what it is to be human than that. There's necessarily there are kind of like necessary like interconnections with humans, and per Marx, Marx says, well, how we got there is by this system of kind of economic necessity that rips people apart from one another.
Yeah, but fortunately, there's a solution. The solution is the negation of the negation.
I love the negation of the negation. I can't get enough negating.
Yeah, I know. What the fuck does that mean? But that's what Marx says. The solution to all of this is what Marx calls communism. Well, I shouldn't say Marx, actually, because socialism and communism existed as terms and ideas before Marx. But Marx is setting all of this up and being like, yeah, this is the problem, which we've been talking about. But the solution is communism. Under communism, we won't be alienated from our labor. We won't have privately owned property. Which is really, as far as I can tell, as much detail as I can get from the what is communism question. He literally, the negation of the negation, he says, communism is the negation of the negation. And I have next to no idea what that means. Well, I don't know. I was thinking about it today, and this is the best I could come up with. And I wonder what you think of this, right? So Hegel, when he's talking about the human mind and how it comes to know things in the world, is that it does it through a process of negation, right? I look at you and I go, I am not you. So I have consciousness of myself through negating something else. I know that I am not you. You are an other. So therefore I must be something else. And you do this with everything. I don't know, this pen is not this highlighter, right? I negate one to sort of understand the essential properties of the other, right? So you have this process of negation in human cognition, and that's how you come to know the world. But it's sort of understanding things as they relate to something else, right? And so how does that get instantiated economically and politically? It's doing things in relation to something else. It's when the ends and the means sort of get confused. So I labor in order to survive, right? The laboring only has meaning in reference to my desire, my need for a wage, rather. Its meaning is only in relation to something else. Whereas in capitalism, we're freed from that. In communism, we're freed from that. I don't have to go and sell my labor in the labor market in order to attain a wage. I have financial security. I can do things for their own reasons. I do not need to subject them to this other kind of logic. I don't need to say, well, I'm going to start a podcast because I have to do it to earn money. I'm just going to do it, even if no one listens to it, because that's how I want to spend my time, and that's what brings me happiness. So it's getting rid of this something is only understood by reference to something else. The ends are the means and the means are the end, and it is an aesthetic way of thinking. So you're negating the negation, right? You no longer have to understand things in reference to something else. Things are on their own terms. That's the best I could come up with in terms of what the fuck the negation of the negation means. But I could be completely off the mark with that.
Yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense, what you explained. But like you said, because I had no idea what Marx was saying, I don't know if that's what Marx was saying. That's not a no. I genuinely don't know what Marx was getting at. But what you said actually makes sense. Like, I get what you're saying there.
Well, thanks, because halfway through that I was like, wait, fuck, what, where am I going with this? But I think it does, even if that's not what he means by the negation of the negation, it is nonetheless a point I think that he is making elsewhere, because you recently read How to Philosophize with a Hammer and Sickle. I recently picked that up. I haven't read it yet, but I'm told by you that towards the end of the book, the author, whose name I don't want to mispronounce, says that Jonas Chaker. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
That the subject-object divide in Western philosophy will be solved under communism, which you found sort of too abstract and theological, and I guess over too metaphysical. But I think that's kind of what I was just saying. It's like you under communism for Marx, you no longer see yourself standing in opposition to nature, or you don't see yourself standing in opposition to anything else. It's sort of the distinction becomes collapsed, and we are part of nature, and we basically just do things for their own self-justifying ends. There is no I'm doing X because Y. It's just I'm doing X because that's what it is to be human.
Yeah, I was thinking that as well. That whole thing from the Shaker book came to mind when I was reading this, especially when he got to the part of under what it is to be human, seeing yourself, recognizing yourself in the objects that you create, so that your subjectivity is within your object. So like when I read that Jonas Shaker book, he said, and under communism, the subject-object divide could collapse or whatever, or could cease to be a sensible distinction. And the problem I had with it there is that he literally just said it and he left it at that, and I was like, what the hell does that mean? Like, what is going on? But I read this and I realized, like, oh no, he's actually drawing it from here. But this is kind of where my skepticism comes in, because I can see the philosophical argument for it. What I don't see is the roadmap, which is something that Marx and pretty much, the vast majority of, Marxist leaning philosophers either don't or can't talk about, which is how do we get from, here, this point of capitalism, to the point of communism, where we live in this world of seeing yourself embodied. How do we get to the negation of the negation in this world of money and power and whatnot. And Marx, he doesn't really talk about it here, but he later says we need a revolution. Actually, 4 years after he wrote this in the Communist Manifesto. But again, you could do that, but like when you've done the revolution, okay, like then what?
Yeah. This is interesting because I feel like there are sort of two ways in which you can critique Marx and Marxism. And one of them is what you just said. It's like, okay, this sounds like a very excellent critique, and communism, from what you've described, sounds like it might be better. Well, then what are the steps forward? How do we get there? And beyond some sort of vague call for revolution, that's not really clear. So you can critique it on that front, which I don't know. I think is fair to make that point against Marx. Although I think also that point gets used to justify not reading him, which even if you, even if you admit that he's a bit light on the steps forward, I think that's fine, because what I've always took from Marx is it's probably the best self-contained analytical framework for understanding politics.
Yeah, for sure. Like, don't get me wrong. When I say that, I say that with the opinion that I've gained a ton from reading him.
Yeah,
I think
exactly.
In terms of like his kind of like analytical skills and, giving this framework of like, okay, here's my, matrix vision of how everything works. I'm like, well, that actually makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. You do get red pilled reading Marx to a certain extent. You get materialism pilled. But I think also what Marx himself would say in response to that critique is that, well, I can't give you a step-by-step process because, you just need to respond to events. Remember, there's a sort of historical dynamic going on here, and you can't. I mean, if we're going to be like, if we're going to have fidelity to Marx verbatim, I mean, other people, later Marxists, have disagreed with this, and they're called accelerationists, that you can sort of speed this historical process up. But if we're going to have fidelity to the original Marx, he would say, well, this is just a process. Like, you can't go out tomorrow and, I don't know, run for parliament and speed up the development of capitalism and bring in communism 2 weeks from now. Like, that's just absurd. And you have to pay attention to the unique local circumstances that you're in. So the route to socialism in Australia might look very different from the route to socialism in China, for argument's sake, right? So I think that might be what Marx would say in response to that first point.
No, I think that's fair enough. Like, it's fun to critique these thinkers on not being able to say how to get to their world that they argued for, but you can't really expect someone to be a philosopher and a tactician at the same time. Though there's another critique that I'd kind of levy at this, which is the idea that we can even get to some, not just, I've given, I have this critique in my head of like, okay, like how do we functionally get from A to B? But there's also this other critique that floats around in my mind, which is, can B ever be reached? Is that even a sensible thing to think about? Because I don't know, if you're Hobbes pilled, if you're Thomas Hobbes pilled, if you're Machiavelli pilled, and well, politics is essentially just power. Power is the basis of all politics, really. And for political leaders, their first and foremost kind of imperative, their core imperative, your core imperative as your political leader, as a political figure. This goes for, an elected official, or this goes for, trade union leader, this goes for a CEO, whoever is in a position of power, is to maintain your own power. It is to maintain your position that you are currently in, and hopefully as well move even further up. That is what you have to put all your resources in. And how do you do that? How do you kind of maintain your power and move further up? That's to reward your friends and reward the people who put you in power, and if possible, take resources away or like punish the people who oppose you. And anytime that there's been any sort of, I don't know, like revolution in a society or change in society, we see this process rear its heads. You know, people talk about how like X or Y revolution was betrayed. You know, it was so and so, they betrayed the revolution. And I used to be like, yeah, that sucks. Why would you be mean and do that thing? And now I realize, like, well, no, if you just rip a massive power vacuum in a society, then someone's going to fill that power vacuum, because politics is power. And they're going to do what they need to kind of stabilize the situation, stabilize their own position there. And in the process of all that happening, you might not especially like how that goes. You might not like how that vacuum is filled. And there's no real reason to suppose that after this revolution has taken place, this kind of imperative to maintain your power, to fill that power vacuum, is just going to result in everybody like kind of holding hands together. Maybe this is just kind of like a naive critique of Marx. Maybe this is a critique of people who like have naive readings of Marx. I don't know what Marx himself would say about this, but I don't know. That's been my big bugbear with the whole project for the last month or two.
I think I think what I would say about that is that's certainly the case as things are now. And that's certainly like history as it has been. The question is like, is that going to be eternal, or can we sort of break out of that cycle? And yeah, I mean, I don't know. I would like to think that we can, but I kind of share your skepticism that that's ever possible. But let me just like try and be charitable and say maybe what Marx may have said about that is because you were talking about before, right, that within society you have sections of society that have their own interests. And so politics is power, and politics is like clashing, competing interests. The liberal solution to this is to just sort of like mediate and try and stop people clashing, and when they do clash, like have a state that has a liberal legal system that protects private property rights. But other than that, it doesn't really try and do away with like the fundamental clash of interests that people are always going to have. It's just like, okay, how can we harness this and use it for the betterment of society? Whereas the Marxist understanding of that is, well, we only have competing interests under capitalism, right? It's sort of everything you've just said is the problem, right? And like, again, I agree with you. It's naive because there's no real like, how do we get there? But hypothetically, under communism, that way of thinking that you've just described is not going to be the case, because I don't know if this is a Marxist point per se, but it was in William Kimlicker's Contemporary Political Philosophy textbook, which I think is quite good. He has a good chapter on Marxism, even though he's a liberal. And he addresses this point in the Marxist tradition by saying, well, under communism, you have a harmony of interests. Everyone has the same interest, right? You're no longer separated into these competing classes, which sounds completely like a fairy tale. And yeah, I agree with that to an extent. But in fairness to the thought itself, politics is the reflection of material basis. And one of the reasons why you have conflict in politics today is because we exist in conditions of scarcity. So people are competing for resources. But the whole point of communism is that it's only possible when we transcend scarcity, when we develop the material productive forces to such a point that we don't need to fight for food and shelter and resources anymore, because we are so technologically advanced scarcity just evaporates. Now, Marx was saying that in the 19th century, and it didn't happen. And then Keynes said it in, the early 20th century, that by 1980, we'd all be working 15-hour weeks because we would have the technological progress to do that. And here we are in 2022, and we're overworked. So some people say, oh, well, maybe it'll happen with the development of AI, right? And there's that whole book by Aaron Bassini, what is it, Luxury Communism, where he argues exactly that AI is finally what will give us communism because we'll liberate humanity from scarcity. So I don't know. I feel like Marxism has answers to these problems. It's just a question of whether you find them persuasive.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm just too much of a historian brain to think we can ever move past it. There's and another point. This isn't necessarily a critique, at least as far as I stand, but the whole idea that we can, there's a direction to history, and that we will eventually reach a point in history where we have sort of deliverance from the pains, the trials and tribulations of the past, from the old oppressions. It's incredibly Christian. Marx spends a lot of time critiquing religion. He draws a lot on this philosopher called Feuerbach, who critiqued Christianity. But I don't know, like he took the God out and he brought materialism in, but the whole basic kind of, you might say, the plot line of this ends up still being very Christian as far as I can see.
Yeah, communism just sounds a lot like, it will be done on earth as it is done in heaven, right? Like it just sort of sounds like it's bringing the kingdom of
Jesus
God
returns.
down here. Yeah, pretty much, right? Pretty much. When the proletarian works out that he has the keys to the kingdom of heaven within himself. And yeah, I agree with you. It is all sort of drawing on Christian ways of thinking. And I mentioned this to you, I don't know, a week or so ago, that there's a book about this, the idea of the history of progress by someone Nisbet. I can't remember their first name. But this is the whole thesis. It's this Christian way of thinking, that there's this notion of progress, and that we can transcend, like history doesn't just repeat itself, where actually things are getting better as time moves on. And that is such a hardwired way of thinking for us Westerners. And to even think of that as being, I don't know, a cultural feature is kind of bizarre. But I agree, like a lot of that is in Marx. And again, it's Christian, but it's also very Aristotelian. It's very teleological, that sort of all humans have within themselves an essence. And the task of politics is to basically get out of the way and to let that essence unfold. And humans have their own inbuilt purpose, and just let it rip. It's a very Aristotelian, turn Christian, turn liberal, turn Marxist way of thinking. These things all sort of follow one another in a neat, or not, definitely not neat, but in a sort of traceable historical line.
Man, goes to show this is all really deeply within the tradition, isn't it? But
yeah, absolutely.
So, all right, we smashed out Alienation and had that big critique discussion. There is a closing chapter where Marx is kind of talking about and critiquing Hegel, Hegel's philosophy specifically. And I'll be honest, I had a lot of trouble actually understanding what was going on there. Did you manage to pass much of it? Because I have very little familiarity with Hegel.
Not really. I don't have much familiarity with Hegel either. Although you were with me the other day when I bought Phenomenology of Spirit. So I think
you pretty much read it.
It's sitting on my shelf, and every day I learn a little bit more about it. Um, it's ambition that may or may not be met for quite some time. But no, I think perhaps in terms of Marx's critique of Hegel is not going to make a whole lot of sense. If not to us, certainly not to the listeners, if we have not previously talked about Hegel that much. So yeah, I think it might be worth wrapping it up there, to say that the takeaway messages of the manuscripts, at least for me, is that it helps you understand centrally why Marx is so concerned with the situation of the working class under capitalism, and that is because they're alienated. And why is alienation so bad? Because labor is central to the human essence. There are two claims there, really, that humans have an essence, which you might want to dispute. And that secondly, our essence is that we are producers. We like to make things. We, engage in our creative powers. Again, I feel like he presents that as if it's axiomatic, but I don't know. I'm aware of, like, for example, David Graeber, who, was an anthropologist, rest in peace, died recently. He rejects that aspect of Marx, and he has some interesting anthropological evidence from, I think, Siberia, of basically tribes that did not produce in the way that Marx said was central to humanity. They didn't go and produce over and above necessity, because Marx says, well, humans are unique and they don't just produce for necessity, they produce over and above that. They do things, they create for creating its own sake. Graeber has evidence to the contrary of some tribes that don't do that. So again, I don't really know how much of this we should accept at face value, other than to say that Marx's problem with capitalism is that it alienates us from our labor, and labor is very, very important.
Yeah, when you read him, especially his later stuff, he can seem like this sort of colder, distant figure, but you read this and you get the impression that he's concerned, he's actually deeply human.
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very deeply human. Which, again, if people are interested in this, there's a short book that I would recommend by a beautiful writer. It's just called Marx, and it's by Terry Eagleton. And I feel
very good read.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And he talks about this, Marx's idea of freedom and labor and alienation so well. And I think that book is what pushed me over the edge into, at least in some sense, describing myself as a Marxist, would be that Terry Eagleton book.
Yeah, definitely give that a read. It's very short, very accessible, very well written. All right. So that's Marx wrapped up. I think in the last one we said that we'd be doing 2 episodes, but in the interim, we decided no, we don't actually want to do 2 episodes on Marx. So next episode, I think we said, did you want to do Spinoza?
Yeah, I'm going to start Spinoza like tonight or tomorrow, because I have to. It's part of my thesis research. So yeah, if I'm going to read it anyway, Spinoza's Ethics, people.
I've got my copy on the shelf, which means I've pretty much already read it.
And yeah, exactly. If people need justification for why Spinoza, I would say briefly that, because Spinoza's idea of freedom was picked up by Hegel, which was picked up by Marx. So, these things all relate to one another. And if you want to understand Marx, going back to Spinoza is not a bad idea.
Very well put. All right. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
Peace, people.